Okay, Professor Lukin, introduce Ambassador Raghavan. So my name is Olga Pizanova. I am a lecturer at the Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs. And today, the Department of International Relations and International Laboratory on World Order Studies and the New Regionalism at our faculty, once again, Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs of the National Research University High School of Economics, is holding the 17th session of Eurasian Online Seminar. Our guest today is a leading Indian diplomat and foreign policy analyst, chairman of the National Security Advisory Board, Ambassador Raghavan. The topic of his talk is India and Russia in the Indo-Pacific. Ambassador Raghavan is chairman of the National Security Advisory Board, which advises India's National Security Council on strategic and security issues. In a diplomatic career of over 36 years, he has served as India's ambassador to Russia from 2014 to 16, Czech Republic and Ireland. He has also held other diplomatic positions in the USSR, Poland, UK, Vietnam, and South Africa. He was Joint Secretary, Director General in the Prime Minister's Office from 2000 to 2004, dealing with the foreign affairs, nuclear, energy, space, defense, and national security during a period of transformation in India's foreign and national security policies. As Secretary, Deputy Foreign Minister in the Ministry of External Affairs, he handled India's external economic relations and oversaw administration, security, and e-governance. He also headed the Development Partnership Administration, which coordinates India's economic partnership program in developing countries, with an annual budget of $1 to $1.5 billion US. He was chief coordinator of the BRICS Summit in New Delhi in March 2012. From 2012 to January 2014, he was special envoy of the Government of India to Sudan and South Sudan. As chairman, National Security Advisory Board, he engages with government departments and think tanks in India and outside on India's strategic perspectives. He writes widely on these issues. So just to remind you, the language of this seminar is going to be English. In order to ask questions, please put down your name and affiliation, as well as the question, if you prefer, in our conference chat. And if I could also ask you to use your real names. We've discussed that the degree of you being removed if you're using an iPhone or an Asus or whatever other name might be fairly high, so I would advise against. Right, thank you so much, Ambassador Raghavan, for finding time for us today, and we are looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you very much for this invitation. It's wonderful to be back in Moscow again, I may say, even if only in a virtual form. You don't get much real in these COVID days, do we? Thank you also for the introduction. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, okay. When Professor Lukin invited me to this seminar, he also said it might be a good idea if I start off by saying a few words about India's foreign policy today, how India sees the world today. So I will preface my remarks with a few words about this. You know, the current phase of India's foreign policy, one can say, dates from the early 2000s. You know, when after the Cold War and after a certain difficult political and economic situation, India embarked on a very strong economic growth on the back of the IT revolution. That brought into play also India's demography, a young country, 1 billion strong, more than 50% below the age of 25. Also, in 1998, we had declared ourselves a nuclear weapons power, thereby declaring our intention to take care of our security more effectively. And of course, if you look at it, I will, I think, share a screen with you, a few maps. Location on the Indian Ocean at a time when the maritime domain became a very important aspect of globalization. In addition to that, we have a vibrant diaspora around the world, not only in the UK and the US, but around the world, which we could leverage in our diversification of international relations. So this was the setting in which India embarked on a much wider international relationship after the Cold War. Of course, Russia, with a traditional partner, we developed a new, vibrant strategic partnership with Russia. It coincided with the advent of President Putin into office in Russia. And very often you'd hear Indian leaders saying President Putin is the architect of the India-Russia strategic partnership. That is not an exaggeration. We actually established three very strong pillars of India-Russia strategic partnership: political, energy, and not least of all, defense. The economic pillar, well, has always remained weak. We can touch on this at a later stage if occasion permits. But at the same time, we also launched on a very energetic strategic partnership with the United States. After a fairly difficult time during the Cold War years, and after sanctions having been imposed on us after our nuclear tests in 1998, from 2000 onwards, we saw opening up of the India-US relationship. The US motivations were pretty clear. They wanted increased trade with an economically vibrant India, trade and investment. They wanted to participate in India's ambitious nuclear energy plans. And obviously, they wanted a share of the India's defense market. India was the largest among the largest defense importers in the world even then, but almost entirely tied to Russia. From an Indian perspective, we also welcomed relations with the sole superpower of the world. We welcomed the opportunities for expanded trade and investment. We wanted American technologies. We wanted American nuclear technologies as well. And of course, we were also happy to diversify our military acquisitions to have a greater choice of military technologies than be tied up to only one supplier. So there were a number of factors going for the Indo-US relationship, but I mention it in detail because of one other factor, which was actually the strategic underpinning of India's relations with the US. That was that at that time, even at that time, in the early 2000s, the US saw China emerging as a challenge to it as the sole superpower of the world. And it saw a partnership with India, a strong, growing India, a democracy in Asia. It saw this partnership as a useful partnership. Now, neither India nor the US talked about balancing China in that sense, but this was a partnership that very much had China in the background, right from the beginning. Also with Europe, that was the time also, if you recall, in the late 1900s and in the early 2000s, Europe was trying to break free a little bit from the US umbrella and to create for itself a place as an independent pole in a multipolar world. There was this Lisbon agenda, there was the European army that was talked about. India developed a very close strategic partnership with EU at that time as well, mainly with UK, France, and Germany, but also with other countries in the EU. We also established a close partnership with Japan. You know, I've often heard it said in Russia that India-Japan cooperation has been through the medium of the US. That's not true. Right from 2000 onwards, Yoshiro Mori, who's actually well known in Russia, established a close partnership between Japan and India, and that is something that we took forward. We strengthened relations with ASEAN. We continued our relationship with the developing countries which we had sort of strengthened during the days of the non-aligned movement. And in addition, West Asia. Again, in West Asia, we have today established very good relations with countries across political, religious, or sectarian divides. So from Saudi Arabia to Iran to Qatar and Israel, our partnership includes security, counterterrorism, and defense cooperation, particularly with Israel. So in short, freed from Cold War shackles, we have sort of tried to leverage our strengths to broaden our network of international relations and to help, in order to help domestic economic growth and development and to expand India's global footprint in a multipolar world. So I would say this is the broad development and outlook of India's foreign policy over the last 20 years. I must also add that the development of these relations simultaneously was possible in an international environment where relations between the three big powers, US, Russia, and China, were functional. I think from about 2014 onwards, the situation has changed very greatly with a very acrimonious US-Russia relationship, which has extended also now to third country sanctions, secondary sanctions, which makes it difficult, which has tried to introduce difficulties for us. The increasing frictions between US and China have also added to the problems. Now, how COVID will impact on geopolitical equations in the world remains to be seen. But I think as far as India is concerned, it will continue on this course of maintaining its independence of action, seeking multilateral and bilateral partnerships that promote its interests in particular areas, and avoiding becoming an ally of any single country or a satellite of any single country. I think this is an important point to make as I move forward to the next section, which is on the Indo-Pacific. Now, of course, you would have noticed that I have left out of this entire description of India's foreign policy a very important relationship, and that is with China, which is not only because it is the most complicated, but also because it ties in with the subject of the Indo-Pacific, which is my next piece. Now, India-China saw a very strong revival of relations in the early 2000s. We put behind us the baggage of 1962 when we had a major war, which didn't turn out very well for India. And that had actually sort of stained India-China relations over the decades. But starting from the mid-1990s, we worked out a kind of an arrangement by which we would let the unresolved border dispute between us, put it on the side while trying to solve it, permit other areas of the relationship to be developed to mutual benefit. Now, in 2003, we made a breakthrough when India and China agreed on appointment of special representatives by the leaders of the two countries that would who would approach our boundary issues from a political perspective, and meanwhile to take forward our economic and other relationship. Now, this is the period when the India-China trade grew very rapidly. China is today China is today among the top 2 trade partners of India. It keeps alternating between China and the US, but with a $90 billion trade turnover. We have, that was a period when also the Russia, India, China trilateral format was established, BRICS was established. So it widened the range of India-China cooperation simultaneously with the increase in, with the improvement in, or rather the strengthening of India-Russia and India-US relations. Now, all this changed in the period around 2006, 7, 8, when the relationship started going downhill. The special representatives meetings ceased to produce results, and agreement that they had reached on certain political parameters for settlement of the boundary dispute, we felt that China had reneged on it. If one were to, I can move to the next slide. That's right. Which essentially shows the problems along the India-China border, including, of course, what is at the moment the point of dispute, which is around the Aksai Chin region. But what actually happened was that the special representatives ceased to make progress. Chinese claims on various parts of Indian territory became shriller. A particular agreement that we had, the special representatives had about not upsetting settled populations in the search for a boundary settlement, that actually referred to places in the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh. We felt that China had gone back on it. Now, there are various theories about it, where people a lot of experts have said that the strengthening of India-US relations has really diluted Chinese desire to maintain more cordial relations with India. There are others who say that it coincided with the increased nationalism in China, where the Chinese policymakers decided that they need not make concessions on areas of the boundary and other such areas. What followed thereafter was, and this was something not only India, China, but around the world, increased Chinese aggressiveness and assertiveness in its region and beyond. From an Indian perspective, of course, we know about the 9 dashed lines and the Chinese claims, territorial claims on the islands in the South China Sea, and the manner in which it has sought to enforce them. But from an Indian perspective, the Belton Road Initiative was a major challenge, and particularly if you look at it, I mean, we all know the elements of the Belton Road Initiative: the Silk Road Economic Belt, which is the land corridor, and the Maritime Silk Road, which is the sea. There, particularly the Maritime Silk Road, which, if you look at it, is China's Indo-Pacific strategy, a method by which it links up ports along the Indian Ocean, along the entire Indo-Pacific, across India into the East African coast. Added to that was increased Chinese activism in India's neighborhood, both whether you look at Nepal or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Maldives, strengthening political, economic, and military relations. And of course, we talk about the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which extends from Western China across land which India considers its own. It's part of the part of Kashmir, which India considers as occupied by Pakistan, across that all the way to the Arabian Sea. So China's relations with Pakistan until a few years ago, in a way, seemed to be aimed at keeping India boxed into the subcontinent, supporting Pakistan's missile and nuclear programs, supporting Pakistan in international fora on Kashmir, generally to keep India boxed down in the subcontinent. But with the Belt and Road Initiative, and particularly this China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, we see a major quantum shift in Chinese strategic presence in the region, which obviously is of great concern to India. Now, why is it of such great concern to India, and where does it fit in with the Indo-Pacific, is what I'm coming to. Yeah. The Indo-Pacific, firstly, I think contrary to the narrative that the Indo-Pacific is an American concept imposed on India, I must point out that Indo-Pacific was actually a concept which was first articulated by an Indian strategic thinker called Gurpreet Khurana in 2007. It was then, he talked about the importance of this space, the oceanic space of the Indian and the Pacific Oceans for India's economic and security interests. Prime Minister Abe of Japan then took it up later and talked about the confluence of the Indian and Pacific Ocean and how that should be, that has a geopolitical significance for free movement of across this oceanic space. The US brought it into its geopolitical lexicon only much later, in fact, in the second half of the Obama administration. But let us see why this region is critical for India. Actually, if you look at it, India can be called a sea-locked country. If you look at India's land borders, you see Pakistan, you see Xinjiang, Tibet, and the other side, Myanmar. They're all, whether it's political or geographical factors, they actually limit the movement of goods and people across them. Therefore, India's external interaction is almost entirely across the oceans. The Indian Ocean carries something like 90% of India's trade, including most of its energy supplies. Its marine resources are of great importance to our littoral states. Its movement, since it lies on a major maritime corridor, the movement of arms, drugs, and human trafficking across it is of great significance to us. And of course, movement of terrorists was shown when we had an attack on Mumbai about 10 years ago, where the terrorists came from the sea. So and also I must say that moving beyond the Indian Ocean, about 55% of India's trade goes past the Straits of Malacca. Therefore, it's not only India's interest in the Indian Ocean, it is India's interest in the Indo-Pacific. Foreign trade is increasingly, it now contributes about 40% to India's GDP, and that figure is increasing. So from every perspective, this space is of economic and political interest to India, and it is the primary responsibility of the Indian Navy to expand its capability in this region in order to protect these economic and economic and security interests. And therefore, no, India's naval capability in this region is not at the behest of any other outside power, but in defense of our own security. Now, the Indo-Pacific, the expression Indo-Pacific, the predecessor to this Indo-Pacific expression is what you call the Asia-Pacific. The Asia-Pacific, as defined mainly during the Cold War time, really consisted of an expanse which extended from ASEAN to the the western Pacific seaboard of the US. But Asia-Pacific is not a geographical concept. It is basically a geopolitical concept, and it is a concept of the Cold War. It was a region where during the Cold War, the US extended a security umbrella for protection of the region against a Soviet threat. And after about 1972, China was more or less a passive observer in this exercise. Now after the end of the Cold War, this obviously became an obsolete construct. The military threat is no longer there. The ideological cohesion is no longer there. So it's obvious that the Asia-Pacific cannot today form the basis of any sustainable security architecture. However, even after the Cold War, India, which very much should be a part of this region in terms of, as I said, economic and security interests, was not part of the dialogue of the Asia-Pacific. When APEC was, India still is not a member of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. Even when the ASEM, the Asia-Europe meeting was instituted, it was instituted in 1996. India was admitted to this only in 2006. So this is a glaring anomaly that actually distorted the balance of the dialogues in the region. You know, you have the second largest country in the region with a $2.8 trillion economy, 1.3 billion people who have extensive interests in this region, and they were excluded from the dialogue relating to this region. So this is the reason why the Indo-Pacific suits India's interests, because it actually removes this anomaly. Now, of course, when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, India talks about the Indo-Pacific as the entire expanse from the East African coast to the US Pacific seaboard. But for most discourses, including, I think, for the purposes of today's discussions, we basically talk about the Eastern Indo-Pacific, that is from the east coast of India across. Because the problem, the Western Indo-Pacific is of very great importance to India as well. And it is very great importance to Russia as well. Russia is much more active there. So, however, the problems and the challenges of that part of the Indo-Pacific are different. And I think we have a different dialogue with Russia on those problems where China actually does not play such a prominent role. So coming back to the Eastern Indo-Pacific, where are we? What are we wanting in the East Indo-Pacific? What does India want in the Indo-Pacific? To put it very simply, because of our interests in this region, we are interested in ensuring that this region does not become the hegemony of any one power. Now, if you look at China's enforcement of its 9-dash line, you look at its aggressive actions with Vietnam and Malaysia, but also with Japan, Korea, and Mongolia over the years, look at the geopolitical ambition which is manifest in the Silk Road Economic Belt as well as the Maritime Silk Road. Look at CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. All of these arouse concerns about a desire for hegemony. Now, obviously, this is not a worry for India alone. ASEAN countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, as well as all the countries, Japan, Korea, and Australia, have expressed this concern. And there have been bilateral and multilateral discussions that India has had with other countries and other countries have had about how an open, inclusive, and rules-based order or a security architecture can be established in this region. Now, what are the elements of such an architecture? Essentially, I think countries in the region have to individually and jointly build capacities that can protect their political and economic aspirations. And this will have to include military capacity because, you know, an extreme power asymmetry in the region is destabilizing. And as I mentioned earlier, a total reliance on a security umbrella from a distant power is not really a practical option in today's world. Now, the other aspect of this, you know, if you look at the political and economic dynamics of the world today, the objectives of all the exercises for all the initiatives of the Indo-Pacific cannot be to contain China. I mean, that train, if it was ever there, left the station 15 years ago. China as a economic, military, and technological power cannot be contained. And I don't think any effort to contain China is really a practical one. Every country in the Indo-Pacific region has very strong economic interdependence on China and have absolutely no interest in confrontation with China. But what you do want to do is to create a template in which China would desist from unilateral actions to impose what it considers as its national interests to the detriment of the political and economic aspirations of other countries in the region. Now, this may mean, for example, a code of conduct in the South China Sea that is a bit more accommodative, not only of the ASEAN countries, but also of other countries which treat the South China Sea as an international passageway. It could mean making the Belton Road Initiative more responsive to the development goals of recipient countries, more debt sustainable, more transparent. I mean, these are just some examples of what we can do in order to make China respond more to what the countries in the region want. Now, it's also true that all the discussions about the Indo-Pacific are work in progress. You know, you have a number of countries which are now talking about cooperation in establishing a security architecture in the Indo-Pacific. The elements of such a security architecture are defined differently by different people. And the pathways to reaching such an Indo-Pacific and such a security architecture there are also widely differing perspectives about this. Now, if you look at, for example, the most commented upon dialogue in the Indo-Pacific, it is what it's called the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue of India, Japan, Australia, and the US. Now, amidst all the hype about it, is very important to recognize what the Quad is and what it is not. The Quad is not a strategy. The Quad is a group of countries which are looking to see what can be done to promote the objectives which I mentioned before of drawing China into a cooperative enterprise. The Quad is certainly not an alliance. It may have the broad objectives of political equilibrium and sustainable architecture, but its members are differ a lot about the definition of these terms and how to achieve them. Now, everyone wants respect for sovereignty and independence of nations. They want the peaceful resolution of disputes. They want free and fair trade. They want freedom of navigation. All of this is part of the Indo-Pacific objectives which you can hear many people talk about. But all of them, if you take a look, for example, at how the United States frames its strategy, Indo-Pacific strategy, it frames it in the context of a geopolitical rivalry between free and repressive world order visions. And it promises, I quote, a lethal, resilient, agile, and combat effective Indo-Pacific force posture. Now, this formulation actually worries even its close allies like Australia, who are in the Quad. So, in short, therefore, Quad and other such multilateral initiatives in the region still have to reconcile the nuances of individual interests and individual constraints of countries in the region. So, having said this, given this background, I believe that there is every reason that Russia should be willing to make this transition from the Asia-Pacific, which is a construct which it always says it is more comfortable with, to the Indo-Pacific. We had, senior Russian diplomats have often said that the Indo-Pacific is basically a US effort to draw India and Japan into a close military alliance with it. I think that does not appreciate India's perspectives on the Indo-Pacific, which I outlined at great length a little bit earlier. The fact that the Asia-Pacific, India was out of the Asia-Pacific and is in the Indo-Pacific to start with, but also that we do not have congruent interests with countries, with any of these countries, to make an alliance. An alliance presupposes a congruence of interests. And in today's world, and today's post-Cold War world, which is a churn of countries seeking to establish their own place in a multipolar world, the concept of an alliance, which is the Cold War concept, just does not fit. Actually, what is more practical is the idea of a joint venture. There was, in fact, it's an American think tank talking about an India-America relations that suggested that rather than a partnership, a joint venture was a more suitable model for the India-US partnership. Well, I would say the joint venture is the most suitable template for all major partnership in today's post-Cold War world. And therefore, we should not really be talking about, far less the Quad as a potential alliance. And of course, if you want to sort of illustrate the fact that partnership, joint ventures rather than alliances should be the order of the day in today's world, I think you need to look only at the Russia-Turkey relationship. Here is a NATO country, which is a partner of Russia, and where also you have Russia and Turkey with each other in Syria and with slightly different perspectives in Libya. I mean, these are adjustments that countries make in their relationships with each other. Now, also, I would like to say that the concept of the Indo-Pacific fits in wonderfully with the vision of the greater Eurasia that President Putin outlined a few years ago, and that has been taken forward in a number of elaborations by Russian academics, including the Valdai Discussion Club, of which, of course, our host, Professor Alexander Lukin, is also a member of. And I have seen a number of explanations of how this greater Eurasia would work. And in all of them, you have a mention of how do you bring China into a cooperative, collaborative relationship in the region, how Chinese hegemony in the region. And I can read one quote from one of the various papers that the Valdai Discussion Club has brought out on. It says the idea of greater Eurasia is, quote, to immerse China in a pool of ties, cooperation institutions, balances, and agreements, so as to prevent its possible transformation into a hegemon against which other Eurasian countries would inevitably team up. And at another point, another of these papers says, excessive dependence is dangerous everywhere. This is where the geopolitical component of the greater Eurasia concept comes in. It aims to create a common space for cooperation, development, and security. So what we are talking about, what India is saying about an Indo-Pacific rules-based order ties in perfectly with this. And this is something that has been discussed between India and Russia at the top level in September last year when Prime Minister Modi was at the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok. In fact, he announced a $1 billion line of credit which will support Indian cooperation with in the Far East, and also opening up opening up a maritime corridor from Vladivostok to Chennai, which again reasserts the shared economic and security interests that India and Russia have in the Indo-Pacific. And in fact, at the joint press conference at the summit in Vladivostok, President Putin said that India and Russia had discussed security and stability in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. This is actually the closest that any senior Russian leader has come to mentioning the Indian and Pacific Oceans together, or the Indo-Pacific in some form or the other. So I rest my case here. I think that the Indo-Pacific is a concept which is relevant for today. It is a concept that should not be seen as basically an attempt at an alliance. It's a concept that is relevant to India and Russia as much as it is relevant to the other countries. But having said all that, I will admit that if you have to eventually establish a viable Indo-Pacific security architecture, it does need a modicum of accommodation, of mutual accommodation between US, Russia, and China. We do not see that happening at the moment. We can hope that common interests will enable that to develop in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for this wonderful comprehensive analysis of all of these interconnections between the important concepts in the region. Now, could I just mention once again that whoever wants to ask a question, please specify your desire, write down your name and your questions in the chat window. Now I give the floor to Professor Lukin to comment on this.
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador. I think could you turn off the presentation so that we can see you?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. I think it's actually the best Indian talk I've ever heard, because it's very comprehensive and kind of gave us a very comprehensive picture of Indian foreign policy towards major players and neighbors. So I think now I have the idea, because I'm not an expert on India, of course, and usually like other Indian speakers usually are very specific about one problem, but don't give this comprehensive picture. But I still have a question though about Indo-Pacific in general. Well, Ambassador surely knows that the Russian Foreign Ministry actually rejects this concept because they say that its purpose is to limit the influence of China and Russia in the region. Well, we don't belong to the foreign ministry, so we don't have to accept that. But there is some reason in this vision, I think, because, well, on the one hand, you said that, of course, Indo-Pacific concept is not directed against any specific country. But on the other hand, and that it was, the aim of it was to kind of limit or stop any single country to be a hegemon in the region. But at the same time, when you came to specific countries, you mentioned only China. While China is not the strongest country in the region, I mean, the United States militarily is still much stronger, I would say. And from the Chinese point of view, what they want to do is just to equalize their strength there and influence, and they think that because they are closer to the region, they're part of the region, they have a right to do this. So also, when you compared organizations like SCO or BRICS group, or even the Greater Eurasia Concept Plan, these are all, I would say, institutions that engage China, and China is part of them. So Russia, let's say, thinks that it's better to engage China. Well, you quoted this Waldai Club report or paper, and the idea was that basically, yes, we have this idea that China might become a hegemon, but it's better to, you know, to limit its ambitions with various ties to other countries, including Russia. But you know, Quad, for example, is exclusive. China is not a member. So do you think it's better to engage China or to exclude it from various organizations of the region? Well, thank you very much.
Okay, let me. I think that the three main points you have said. Of course, I am perfectly well aware of what the Russian Foreign Office, Russian Foreign Ministry feels about the Indo-Pacific. But you know, I clarified why the Asia-Pacific, as far as we are concerned, is not a viable construct. The Asia-Pacific is a construct that excludes India. Now, do you want to exclude India from discussions of the region? That's number one. But, you know, I keep coming up against this question that the Indo-Pacific is against Russia and China. Now, the Indo-Pacific does have China at its center of focus. My whole presentation said so. And what is the reason for that? The reason for that is Chinese tendency to hegemony in this region, which I mentioned and which you yourself mentioned. I don't see how this is against Russia. The distinction I'm making is that the Indo-Pacific is seeking to deal with a Chinese characteristic, which is also coincides with Russian needs in that direction. So I cannot understand why people consistently say that the Indo-Pacific concept is against Russia and China. I mean, the basis basically is that because the United States is involved in this, it is, and because the United States has at the moment frictions with both the US, with Russia and China, the assumption is that therefore the Indo-Pacific is against Russia and China. And what I would counter to that is that the dialogue in the Indo-Pacific is with countries which are not hostile to Russia. I mean, look, it's only 2 days ago that our defense minister was there at the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow in person, in spite of the COVID. It's only the same 2 days ago that we had a Russia-India-China dialogue in virtual dialogue hosted by Russia. Japan has got an increasing interaction with Russia in seeking its own balance in the region. So actually, the countries which are involved in the Indo-Pacific, and I did make a distinction. You see, the American strategy in the Indo-Pacific, the American strategy paper, the Department of Defense strategy paper on the free and open Indo-Pacific, it does frame it as a geopolitical rivalry. It frames it as a military strategy. But I also said that that is not an idea which other partners, even within the Quad, subscribe to. Australia doesn't subscribe to that. So we are talking about, actually, when you talk about the Quad, you said, why can't it include China? Yes, of course. Why is it a close? Actually, the Quad, in my view also, and in my view, and I think in the view of many others, cannot actually remain a Quad. If it has to achieve its purpose, it has to expand its scope to include other countries. Now, why doesn't it include China? It doesn't include China because it is basically at the moment looking at how do you deal with China to bring China into a cooperative enterprise. Now, eventually the objective of any Indo-Pacific dialogue has to be to bring China into it. As I said, you cannot contain China. I mean, there's no point even trying to contain China. All of us, you know, I mentioned India's largest trade partner is China. One day it is China, the next day it is the US. We have roughly equal trade turnover with China and the US, about $90 billion. Australia has deep dependencies. ASEAN is even more deeply dependent on China. So we are not talking about hostility to China being the basis. You're talking about actually diplomatic pressure being brought to bear. And that is why I'm saying that what we are saying as part of the Indo-Pacific dialogue is what you are saying as part of the greater Eurasia dialogue. It is just that we seem to be talking past each other and not talking to each other. Now, you also said that we are equating, that in talking about the Indo-Pacific, we are only talking about China and not talking about the other power in the region. Now, in fact, what I mentioned was that as long as we even talk about the US as the balancing force in the Indo-Pacific, I don't think you're going to achieve any equilibrium in the Indo-Pacific. In this region, there are a number of other countries, with political and economic aspirations. Those countries have to step up as well. Those countries have to build their capacities, whether it's political capacities, economic capacities, military capacities, because as you have said in one of your various Valdai papers, extreme asymmetry is destabilizing. So we need to create greater stability in the region. So that is the reason why we actually keep talking about China, because that region is basically today China's region. I mean, you cannot contest the fact that it is China that dominates the South China Sea. And if you look at the BRI, the Maritime Silk Road, in fact, the US, for all that people say that it is in that region, the US has largely been absent in the region. It makes a presence in the region and withdraws from the region from time to time. And that's one of the problems of the Indo-Pacific architecture as well.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I do like how the debate is intensifying from the very first question, thanks to Alexander. Could Anastasia Peteshkova please ask her a very profound question? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I will be intensifying the discussion, but still, there have been many developments due to the pandemic times, and do you expect any new opportunities in India-Russian relations in this sense? For instance, in terms of weapons trade, and I know that it is continuing, and you also told that the region should increase its military opportunities, so how do you see these contexts? And also economic problems can increase hotspots and traditional challenges of security. The next question actually concerns China again, and do you expect any changes in India's strategy against China in the near future or in the long run? Because you mentioned Chinese assertiveness several times. And my third question would be concerning international organizations. We had RIC summit, and they were talking about cooperation and cooperational dimensions. They also mentioned ASEAN formats there. So do you think that multilateral platforms will be efficient in dealing actually with global challenges and country challenges, because we saw many critics that countries just do everything they can on their national level and international platforms are not useful at all. Thank you.
Thank you. That's three totally different questions. About India-Russia defense cooperation, actually, see, India-Russia defense cooperation I mentioned has developed in a very vibrant way. And today it is still, in terms of volume and value, the largest Indian partnership. It's something like, I think according to the last report by SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute, over the last 5 years, India's arms imports, 58% was from Russia. For all that hype about our having imported from other countries and so on, 58% is a large percentage. And we have weapons and equipment in the Indian armed forces, which are about 60 to 70% of our armed forces have that. And I keep telling people who talk about, shifting from one supplier to another, it's not like, you don't change military suppliers like you change your soap or your shampoo. It's far more complex than that. I mean, you have a whole range of equipment, you have their infrastructure there, you have communication structure there, you have interoperability issues. You don't just overnight shift from one to the other. So it's a very deep partnership. Also, the levels of technologies that we're getting from Russia. You see, I talked earlier about diversification of our military acquisitions. That is certainly something that we want to do. We've been quite upfront about it. We do want to have access to varied military technologies, which we are accessing now. We would also like to see, let me be frank, we would also like to see the competition among our suppliers ensure that we get better technologies and more technologies at better prices from our suppliers. I mean, that's, I think, a legitimate aspiration. But having said all that, it's there. I mean, we have, Russia has advantages which other countries don't have. And it is for Russia to, of course, build on these advantages, to be more forthcoming in giving technology, to be more forthcoming in coming to India and manufacturing here, which I think, by the way, is in Russia's interest as well. Faced with sanctions from various quarters, if you actually come to India and manufacture in India, you are actually circumventing sanctions. So anyway, but I certainly do believe that even the fact that our defense minister visited Moscow recently, the fact that we went through with the RIC dialogue, all of that indicates our commitment to a continuing relationship. And if COVID has taught us anything, it has also taught us that you do need to maintain a diversified, not only supply chain, but diversified relationships. So it should actually argue more in favor of strengthening existing relations. So that's as far as India-Russia relations goes. India's policy towards China, as you're aware, even as we speak, we are dealing with a very tense situation along our border. Now, we've had a very difficult relationship with China, and that's something Russia should understand. Russia has had a much older strategic issue with China. Ours is actually only a few decades. For you, it's a few centuries. You've dealt with China in different ways. So we have consistently faced the situation, as I mentioned in my presentation, that we feel that China has acted to curb India's role in the world, to keep India bogged down in the subcontinent. And over a period of time, the strategic rivalry has only increased. As I said, we made a very strong effort in the early 2000s. We had an excellent period of relations when everything went wonderfully, trade surged. And today, in fact, the result of that is that if you see an Indian with a smartphone, the chances are 4:1 that is holding a Chinese smartphone in his hand. Similarly, Chinese presence in our consumer electronics sector here. So we've had a huge increase in economic cooperation, but that does not seem to have resolved the strategic rivalry between us. And we, of course, India believes that it is for China to come forward and to enable relations to proceed on a more equal footing. So what is our solution? Our solution, therefore, is, and what should we be trying to do? We should be trying to narrow the asymmetry between India and China, because over the last 20, 25, 30 years, a very wide asymmetry has developed between India and China. So our effort would be to narrow this asymmetry. Our effort would be to do this both through domestic efforts and through international collaboration so that we are able to deal with China on a more equal footing. That's basically going to be the way India-China relations will develop. International organizations, I think, you see, actually COVID has, everybody says that COVID has transformed geopolitics. I don't think it has transformed geopolitics so much as brought to the surface geopolitical issues that have been lying dormant for a long time. And one of those has been the collapse of multilateralism. The international organizations have simply not been functioning the way they ought to be functioning. And I think most eloquent show of that was how the UN Security Council was unable to issue any kind of a statement on how to deal with COVID. So it brought in the political and other enmities among, not enmities, well, let us say frictions between the permanent members. And now similarly, the G7 was unable to make a statement. The G20 issued a statement, which I think if you search among papers, you'll find it. It's no more than the paper it is written on. Now, the WTO has effectively, its functioning has got degraded. Other institutions are simply not delivering what the international organizations were expected to develop in terms of a rules-based international order. Will COVID change it? Very difficult to say. In fact, what COVID seemed to show was an increasing move towards tribalism rather than internationalism. Countries grew up, even the European Union closed its borders within each other, within itself, the countries of the European Union. The kind of debates that took place in Europe about whether how much the northern countries should help the southern countries for the COVID, you can see that. So will all this be corrected? I mean, will we learn from the lessons of COVID? It's very difficult to say because public memory is very short. What you feel today and what you're saying are the problems today, you'll forget about tomorrow. And tomorrow when your current economic problems face you, you'll forget about the long-term strategic solutions. In every democratic country, it's the economic problems that win or lose you the elections. Strategic issues don't win or lose elections. So very difficult to say whether you'll finally have a renewal of internationalism. And I know it's actually very difficult to talk about a post-COVID situation when we are all in the middle of COVID. Even those countries which have passed the peak are still facing the impact of COVID. Countries like India, which is still moving towards the peak, it's still facing the issues. So, I mean, I don't know. I don't know whether after COVID we'll have better internationalism or worse internationalism.
Right, thank you so much. We have a fantastic question here from Dr. Natasha Cord from the KCL, from King's College London. Natasha, please.
Hi, and thank you very much, Ambassador, for a really wide-ranging, interesting discussion. I don't think we here in the UK always quite appreciate some of these dynamics. I just had a question on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, it's often characterized as a league of authoritarian gentlemen. How do you see India's role in that organization, given that India very much positions itself as the world's biggest parliamentary democracy?
Good question, but I think one needs to go back into history and see how many parliamentary democracies have danced with how many dictatorships around the world. Because eventually I think when you join up with another country, you don't necessarily do so on the basis of a shared commitment to a particular political system. And increasingly in today's world, particularly in the post-Cold War world, I think countries join multilateral organizations or plurilateral organizations like this one, essentially to promote the convergent interests and to sort of push aside the divergent interests, or to promote convergences, to enhance convergences, and to paper over divergences, if you like. Now, why is India in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? I think that's a very good reason for it. I mean, there are a number of reasons for it, but essentially, you see, both Russia and China are huge presences in Eurasia, bordering our extended neighborhood. Russia, by the way, China is the only common border which Russia and India share, the border with China. I mean, both of us have borders with China. The Central Asian landmass, landmass is very strategically located as far as India is concerned. It borders Afghanistan, it borders Iran, it borders Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. So, you know, when you have complicated relations with your neighbors, it makes sense to be present with your neighbors' neighbors. So that's a very important reason why India would want to be within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Central Asia wants India also in there. I remember I attended an international conference there in, I think it was in Astana with Professor Lukin, where you saw how the Central Asians were very happy about India's admission into the SCO, feeling that India could also, in a way, balance the Russian and Chinese influence in Central Asia. I mean, balance not in an antagonistic manner, but in a sympathetic manner. The point is that Central Asia also has old ties with India, and India would like to maintain relations with Central Asia, which will have a positive influence on our common neighbors. So, and other than that, I think India and Russia, of course, have a close strategic partnership that we talked about. Russia-China dynamics, since I'm not now speaking as a government representative, I can be frank as well. Russia-China dynamics are also of both interest and concern to India. You know, India has a very close defense relationship with Russia. And Russia has a very strong defense relationship with China. And obviously, it's a constant matter of, it's something that India has to keep under observation as to the kind of technologies, military technologies that go from Russia to China, vis-a-vis what Russia is supplying to India. So it's part of an India-Russia dialogue. We're very happy with what we hear from Russia. So it's not that something is happening that shouldn't be happening today, but it's something that, again, as countries, as a country which has a difficult relationship with China, the Russia-China relationship is obviously something that India will observe very closely at all times, which is again another reason for India's presence in the SCO.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. Speaking of the Central Asia, we have Professor Kazantsev here, who also wanted to ask a question, a related one.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question about potential consequences of withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan. It has always been major Indian interest, actually, to support whatever actually good government in Kabul, stable government in Kabul existed throughout the history of Afghanistan. And also, actually, destabilization of Afghanistan, if it happens, can be a major game changer actually for all Asia, including India, Pakistan, Russia, China, Iran, etc. So what is your perspective on that? What is your point of view on potential change of situation in Afghanistan in case of complete withdrawal of American troops? Probably a start of new civil war or a formation of effective government there. Of course, there can be different scenarios, but anyway, I mean, for example, you know that Russia supports regionalization of Afghan issues, so more participation from regional actors such as India, Russia, China, etc. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, from all indications, the Americans have decided that they want to leave Afghanistan. Now, if they've decided they want to leave Afghanistan, they will leave Afghanistan, and we have to see what we can do about it. I mean, I don't think there's any other alternative. Now, what are the various alternatives in Afghanistan? there were discussions about this in the early 2000s, if you recall, after the Taliban was ousted from Afghanistan. And there was an international conference and an international participation in trying to see that democracy and could be restored in Afghanistan. Democracy, national reconciliation, and unity. Now that was 20 years ago. The situation is not the same today. The situation is not the same today also because the nature of relations between the big powers is not the same. You saw that in the conference in Bonn, Russia was there, China, India, US, a number of major countries were willing to cooperate in order to deliver a solution for Afghanistan that was, of course, acceptable to Afghanistan. We don't seem to be in a situation where that happens. Now, what will happen now if the withdrawal is precipitated, then you have to see how it could be a civil war, it could be a Taliban government. Now, what will the Taliban mean, the second phase of Taliban mean? What will it mean for destabilization of the region in all directions, including in Central Asia, is something that we have to see, and we have to deal with this. I mean, there are people who tell you that the Taliban now has learned from its past experience and now is willing to be a little bit more pragmatic, both in its domestic administration and in the international relations. Very difficult to say. Actually, today, I don't think there is anybody who can tell you what will result from this uncertain situation. So that's the best answer I can give. And of course, if Afghanistan goes back to the situation that it was in the 1990s, then we're all in for a very difficult time. That's all we can say.
Yes, I'm afraid so. Abhinand Siddharth has two questions to Ambassador Raghavan. Abhinand?
Yeah, I'm turning the microphone on.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador, for the wonderful presentation. I have two specific questions. Considering that China is against the binding nature of Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, do you think strengthening of international legal norms could ensure that no state becomes a hegemon in the Indo-Pacific? And a follow-up question is, do you see any similarities or differences between the Code of Conduct, which is being formulated by ASEAN as well as China, and the rules-based orders stressed upon by the Quad? Thank you.
If you are an international affairs realist, I think you accept that legal norms are those that countries that are willing to accept legal norms will follow. And if you do not accept legal norms, there is not much enforcement mechanism available under international law. The one mechanism that was supposed to be available, the only mechanism actually that was supposed to be available for enforcing peace and security was the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council today is hopelessly divided 3-2 on any subject that you want to take up. Therefore, eventually, it will be through political and diplomatic pressure that you can see that legal norms are abided by countries, not by coercion. And that is so, whether you're talking about the legal norms that China could follow in the South China Sea or elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific region, or even in the rules-based order that you say that the Quad is asking for. You know, yes, the Quad is asking for a rules-based order. But firstly, when you talk about a rules-based order, different countries have different appreciation of the rules. So you first need to have some kind of an agreement of what are the rules based on which the order would be enforced. And secondly, it is countries have to voluntarily accept the rules on based on which the order would be. And that's how international organizations are established. That's how the UN and its agencies are established. Unfortunately, those agreements or those willingness to abide by such norms doesn't exist anymore. And that is the reason why, as we talked about, multilateralism is not is actually not effective anymore.
All right, thank you so much. We have Sergei Lunov here, who is our own, as well as Gumo, one of the most prominent experts on India in Russia, who would like to ask a question.
Yes, 2 or 3 questions, if it's possible. Your Excellency, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation and very interesting answers. My question, for the first question, is about the future of Indo-American relations. India also tries to have absolutely independent foreign policy. And what do you think about the future of Indo-American relations, as the United States doesn't want to see any partner as a real partner? It's also, or it's only subordinate partners. So can India in the future has really good relations with the United States? And from this point of view, I think that not very good position was taken by the Indian establishment. The problem is that it's the role of diaspora, Indian diaspora in the United States. But am I right that only the first migrants from India to another countries have a really friendly relation towards motherland? And Indian migrants of the second generation, they are more loyal to their new motherland than to India. Another question about the triangular, Russia, India, and China. In my opinion, Russia would clearly benefit from enhanced China-India ties, but unfortunately, it is not able, in my opinion, maybe you have another point of view, has no possibility to play the role of intermediator between China and India, because both Asian giants wouldn't be very happy about any attempts to meddle in bilateral disputes. But maybe something can be done by Russia in order to improve the relations between India and China. And maybe it's possible to have some trilateral military exercises. For example, you spoke about the Quad, and inside the Quad, there is this exercise Malabar, and India, the United States, and Japan took part in these exercises. And as far as I know, this year, India would like Australia also to join these exercises. Maybe it is possible to have, in order just to balance, to have the trilateral military naval exercises, Russia, India, China. And my last question about the real economic potential of India in East Asia. Maybe I'm wrong, but these policies, look east, act east, gave a lot of successes for India. But the problem is that if we speak about economic ties of India with the region, it's necessary to say that the most successes were done in the sphere of trade. but the major process in the region is the process of economic regionalization problem, economic integration. And what do you think about the potential of India to take part in this pan-regional integration? Unfortunately, in my opinion, maybe I'm wrong, the successes of India in this sphere were not very significant. Thank you very much.
Thank you. About the India-US relations, you know, we've had these relations develop for a long time, as I mentioned, from 2000 onwards. It has become a strong strategic partnership, but it is not an alliance. And actually, I mentioned that this thing about countries having should be looking at a joint venture model. Actually, this comes out of a very deep study during the Obama administration by the Council of Foreign Relations of the US, which is a very well-known think tank in the US. And the questions that was posed to them was, why are India-US relations not progressing as rapidly as they should be progressing, in spite of the shared interests of both the countries? And essentially, the analysis of that think tank was that given India's political, economic, and other perspectives, it is not possible for the US to get India to become an ally. Essentially, they said that, you know, India's situation in terms of its perspectives, in terms of its geographic situation, does not permit it to become an ally. And the US is, as you said, that's what that report said, that the US is used to thinking of all partnerships as alliances. And therefore, that particular report suggested that India-US relations would benefit very much if the government were to begin to think about it as a joint venture, as areas of convergent interests where you proceed, and areas where you do not have convergent interests, pursue other partners with convergent interests. So long only, I mean, provided only that core security or other interests of one partner is not ignored or countered or opposed by the other in any other partnership. So really speaking, what we would like to see is a very strong partnership with the US, but not at the expense of all other partnerships that we have. You know, as I said in my presentation as well, we're not wanting to become the satellite of another country. We're not wanting to become the junior partner of another country. We do want to have a strong partnership based on convergent interests. So I think that's something that we have continued to signal in many different ways, including by going ahead with the RIC format, including by our very strong the expression of our partnership with Russia at every stage. Second, yes, the second you said was about the diaspora. You know, the diaspora is a very peculiar element in bilateral relations. There are, and I don't think one can say in black and white terms that the first generation is connected with the motherland and that the second generation is totally connected with the country of domicile. We've seen that, and in fact, one of the countries in which I served was Ireland, where the Irish diaspora, they count themselves as something like 80 million or something like that, because they count the 10th or 12th generation diaspora who may have just about 10% of Irish blood. They count them as part of the diaspora. And the diaspora is also happy to count them, count themselves as part of an Irish diaspora. So, you know, the diaspora actually connects itself with its country of origin insofar as it feels that it can promote relations between the country of origin and the country of domicile. So there are, as long as there are no conflicts of interest, if you like, and there should not be conflicts of interest between the diaspora, for the diaspora, between its country of origin and its country of domicile. The diaspora can be actually a force multiplier for bilateral relations to the benefit of both countries involved, the country of origin and the country of domicile. And we've seen that. We've seen that with the US. We have seen that in UK as well. We have participants from UK, I see. So we've seen that in the UK as well. In the Russia, India, China. You see, I don't think, frankly, that there is a role for an intermediary between India and China. We have a very large number of dialogue mechanisms, diplomatic, political, military, and various other at various levels. The problem is not that of our not understanding each other. The problem also is not that of any very complicated issue between us that needs expert technical solutions. The problem is that of trying to adjust strategic perspectives. And even if you look at what is happening, the standoff on our borders today, the standoff is not, really speaking, a border standoff. It is a clash of strategic ideas. And I think for that, what you require is confidence building. And that confidence building has to be between countries, between our two countries. I'm not saying it's not possible. It's certainly possible. As I said, it is an adjustment that both our countries have to make to, as our Prime Minister said, to ensure that competition does not become conflict or differences do not become disputes. So it's not that it's not possible. We've done that in the past. So all our efforts, I mean, I am not saying that we are going to reach a stage where India and China are going to be adversaries. Rivals we may be, but adversaries we should not be. And we can do that ourselves. I mean, I don't think any third party can help in that. Military exercises, well, you know, the SCO conducts joint military exercises where India, Russia, China are there, and along with those
naval exercises.
Naval exercises. I see no reason why we should not do it. But for that, you need to reach a level of confidence. You need to need to reach a level of mutual confidence where it can be done. But I don't see any reason why it cannot be done. It can be done. And I think your last point was about economic and trade relations with Southeast Asia. I accept that has been an area of not sufficient delivery. There are a number of problems. There are a number of, in fact, also our negotiations in RCEP also broke off. We have had issues. We have free trade agreements with ASEAN, which is functioning reasonably well. But I agree with you that our economic engagement, whether it is in ASEAN or whether it is in the broader Indo-Pacific, has not reached levels which match our political or strategic interests in the region. And that is something that does need addressing.
Thank you very much.
Have we exhausted all of Sergei's questions? I believe we have.
Yes, there were 5 of them, and I think I answered all 5. I responded to all 5.
Since we don't have anything left in the chat, I'm going to take the liberty and ask you a question about Japan, because I'm a specialist on Japan. So since you've mentioned it on multiple occasions, could you elaborate a little bit more on what role exactly is Japan playing in the Central Asian region, and is it realizing its full potential? That's question number 1. And then there's the second one as well, which is related to the potential political changes on the Japanese political scene. So as we know, Abe's government is coming to an end, and if Japan were to ever go with changing the constitution towards a more independent one, that is abandoning the controversial Article 9 and becoming more militaristic, what response could it potentially cause in India? Thank you.
I'll answer the second one first, actually, because what actually I did say was that for there to be a reasonable level of political and economic equilibrium in the Indo-Pacific, countries in the Indo-Pacific should develop capability and capacity, and that includes military capacity, capability and capacity. So the change that you're talking about really would enable Japan to, if you like, come out of the closet and have an army, declared army.
I'm going to use this expression.
Sorry?
I'm going to use this expression. It's amazing.
To basically to say that it now has an army. Well, it does have defense forces. It is just that it is cloaked under a different name. So if it can actually overtly have a military capability, I think that is a force for equilibrium in the region and not disequilibrium. Because I do believe, you know, whatever you say, external forces cannot retain, I mean, equilibrium cannot be retained solely by external forces. So even during the Asia Pacific, you had what was allegedly a Soviet threat, which was supposed to have been balanced by a US nuclear umbrella. Then at least you had a certain ideological cohesion, you had a certain, at least perceived existential military threat. That is what kept it together. Today you don't have that. Today you have neither ideological cohesion. I mean, ASEAN is not united on any of these issues, nor do you have an existential military threat. And therefore, the question of, you know, trying to get an outside power permanently engaged in your region is not a possibility. It's not a practical possibility. Therefore, I would say that if Japan does follow the course that Prime Minister Abe wants to do, it would be good for the region. As far as the second goes, Japan, I'm not actually that familiar with what Japan is doing in Central Asia. What I know is that, you know, the project that we, India, Russia, and Iran are quite keen to pursue, the international North-South transport corridor, that will actually enable much better connection between South Asia and Central Asia, since otherwise the only alternative is the land route from Pakistan and Afghanistan, which is mostly closed. Japan is very interested in participating in that, and we would be quite keen to if that happens. But I don't know what exactly Japan is doing in Central Asia and how it is proceeding, frankly.
All right, thank you so much. So since we don't have any more questions, I think I'm going to close this meeting now. We are incredibly grateful for your time today, Ambassador Raghavan. Your presentation was really fantastic, comprehensive, and we all enjoyed it very much. This is a great opportunity for all of us to take part. Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you for your time. It was great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful interaction. Thank you for enabling that.
We all hope to see you in Russia or India in person.
Indeed.
Yes, there is one little object called the coronavirus that you have to deal with, you know.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Look forward. Thank you.